So I thought I'd do something slightly different here, and this is going to be just an audio only podcast. But I just thought I will do a little bit of talking for a change. Well, not for a change, but instead of it being about a TV show. So I thought I'd do a little audio podcast on why was children's TV so special. Well, there's many reasons why it's special. But let's get into a bit of a conversation. So there was a time when television felt completely different. Not because the television itself was different, of course. Well, actually, I suppose it was in a way. It was bigger, as in not in size, as in screen size. It just was bigger. It was heavier. It had buttons on the front. Some still do, but basically you could only control it from the buttons. And sometimes, if you were really unlucky, you had to get up off the sofa to change the channel. I know a few of my friends who used to actually get their pocket money from doing that, so it wasn't always a bad thing. But that isn't really what made childhood TV special. What made it special, I think, was the feeling, the anticipation, the excitement, the music, the characters, the presenters, the programs that seemed to exist just for you. And perhaps, most importantly, the fact that you didn't watch them whenever you wanted to. You know, there was no streaming, there wasn't any YouTube. Well, I suppose it depends how old you are, but if you're an 80s kids or before, or even sometimes 90s. So there was no YouTube, there was no search box where you could simply type the name of your favourite programme and watch an entire episode or series immediately. If you missed it, well, you kind of missed it. And somehow that made watching it even more exciting, even though we didn't probably know that at the time. So today, let's take a little trip back to the days when children's television wasn't something you watched whenever you felt like it. It was something you waited for. So the magic of switching on the television. Think about that moment when you switched on the television. There might be a little click. The screen would slowly come to life. You might have to hit it slightly maybe. And perhaps you saw a few seconds of static. Maybe the picture would roll. And then there it was. Your favourite channel, but I suppose we're talking about, oh gosh, you might only have BBC 1, 2, 3, maybe 4, and 5 if you were watching kids TV in the 90s. Do you remember when Channel 5 people come round to do your TV and video recorders? So your favourite programme. And you knew exactly what was coming next. That feeling is difficult to recreate today because television is everywhere now. You can watch something on a television, on a phone, on a tablet or a computer. You can watch it in the car, on a train, in bed. You can pause it, rewind it, skip it and download it. And watch an entire series in one afternoon. You can even fast forward the series to get through it quicker if you're not particularly enjoying it. But when we were children, television had a sort of rhythm. Now I know that sounds a bit woo-woo maybe. You had to fit around it. If your favourite programme was on at say 4 o'clock, you had to be there at 4 o'clock. And if someone decided that 4 o'clock was a perfect time for you to go upstairs and tidy your room, well, in that case, you had a serious problem. Because there was no, I'll watch it later. There was only, please don't let me miss my favourite programme. But I suppose you could have had a video recorder, perhaps. But most of the time, if you missed it, you missed it. And I think that's probably why a lot of the shows that we grew up on, there was only 13 episodes or maybe 26. Because we watched them all the time because maybe we missed them. So the sound of childhood. And I suppose what that's referring to is the theme tunes. And the theme tunes get stuck in your head. Sometimes you didn't even need to see the television. You could hear the first few seconds of your theme tune from another room, and you knew immediately that it was on. You might be playing with your toys, you might be eating your tea, you might be upstairs, but suddenly you'd hear that familiar music, and you'd stop because your programme was starting. Theme tunes were more than introductions. They were little musical keys that unlocked memories. A few notes now could take you back decades. And that's one of the amazing things about children's television. We don't necessarily even remember every episode, even though we probably think we do. We don't remember every storyline. We probably don't even remember exactly what happened in most episodes. But we do remember the feeling. And often, we remember the music. You could sing a theme tune you haven't heard for 30 years. And somehow, the words are still there, even if you maybe just hum it. You don't know where your car keys are perhaps, you don't remember why you walked to the kitchen as they say, but ask you to sing an old children's television theme, and suddenly your memory becomes perfect. There was something incredibly powerful about those songs. They were short, they were catchy, they were repeated, and they became part of childhood. So let's talk about Saturday mornings. We had Saturday morning television, and for many children, Saturday morning was almost a weekly event. Well, of course it was a weekly event, but we're talking about Saturday morning TV. You woke up, you came downstairs, and the television went on. Now, this could be 6 in the morning. I used to put it on at the crack of dawn. Perhaps you had breakfast in front of it, if you were lucky. Perhaps you were sitting in your pyjamas, and then the television took over. I seem to remember the raccoons. Everything started with the raccoons at the weekend for some reason. One programme became another. A cartoon became a game show. Then a presenter. A competition was usually on. A song, depends on what you're watching. An animated series. Something completely bizarre. Then another programme, and then another. You didn't need to decide what to watch. The television, then the schedule had already decided for you. And that was, I think, part of the magic. You didn't have to search for something. Well, you could just choose what channel, I suppose. You simply sat there and waited to see what happened next. Sometimes you discovered a programme you had never seen before, and sometimes you discovered something you absolutely loved. That was part of the great thing about children's television. It could surprise you with, what you're watching. It could be something new, like I've said, that you might have never seen before. So it was full of surprises, and you might not even look at the schedule as well. So the presenters. Children's television presenters had a very special job. They still do. They weren't just presenting programs. They were talking directly to you. They seemed to know exactly what you were thinking. They laughed with you. Sometimes you laughed at them. They told you what was coming next. They introduced cartoons. They showed you things. They made things, like in Blue Peter. They sometimes made complete fools of themselves, which they did quite regularly. If they meant to or not, I don't know. And that was part of their charm. They didn't always seem polished. They didn't always seem perfect. Sometimes things went wrong, especially on live TV. And children loved that, and I think they probably still do, because it made television feel real. You weren't watching a machine. You were watching people. People who were making mistakes. People who could laugh. People who would get excited. Big kids. Adults that were just on the same page as you. And sometimes people who clearly had no idea what was going to happen next. And perhaps that's another reason we remember them. They became familiar. They became part of childhood. And then there were the characters. Some were clever, some were silly, some were brave, some were completely ridiculous, and some were just strange, and I would say whiz-bit and things like that, but pretty strange. Children's television had always been wonderfully strange, even back in the 60s. I don't know if that meant to be, but it just seems a bit strange, some of those shows, looking back on them. There was no need for everything to make perfect sense. A talking animal? Yep, fine. A puppet living in a television studio? Yeah, why not? And a group of children solving mysteries? Absolutely. You still get shows like that now. A giant costume character wandering around? Well, you know what? perfectly normal. Children accept things that adults would spend hours questioning. And perhaps children's television understood that. I think they did. It didn't always need to explain everything. Sometimes it was enough to say, here is a strange character. Here is an adventure. Off we go. And you loved it. Well, most of the time, unless you were scared of it. So that brings us on to the programs that scared us. Of course, children's television wasn't always comforting. Sometimes it was absolutely terrifying. Well, if you're going to talk about things like Ghostwatch, which I suppose we shouldn't have really been watching. And strangely, we loved the scary things too. There were programs that were supposedly made for children, but contained moments that could stay in our heads forever. A strange character, a dark room, an unusual sound, a villain, a monster, a puppet that looks slightly too realistic. I forget what that guy with the paper mache head now he used to freak me out a little bit. And Mr. Blubby, which, sorry, don't know why. Or perhaps just a piece of music that made you feel uncomfortable. And once you'd seen it, that was it. You couldn't Google the scene, you couldn't find out when it was going to happen again, you couldn't read comments from thousands of other people saying, don't worry, it's only in episode 6. You simply had to live with the memory. And sometimes you didn't even tell anyone that you were scared. You just sat there, watching through your fingers, because you absolutely had to know what happened next. One of the great things about children's television was that it could teach you things without feeling like school. You could learn about animals, science, history, space, the natural world, numbers, words, music, and countries, how things worked, and you didn't necessarily realise that you were learning. You were simply watching something interesting. That's quite a powerful idea, I think. Because curiosity doesn't feel like homework. If a program made you want to know more, you had already learned something. Perhaps you saw something on television that you went to look for in a book. Perhaps a program inspired you to draw, or build, or make something, like Blue Peter, as I said earlier. Well, perhaps you wanted to become an astronaut, or a scientist, or a presenter, or an animator, or an artist. Television could open little doors. And sometimes you didn't realise how important those doors were until many years later. And speaking of making things, children's television was very good at encouraging children to make things themselves. You'd see something on television and suddenly you'd want to make your own version. A model, a drawing, a costume, a cardboard creation. Something from an egg box, something from a toilet roll. Something that probably looked absolutely nothing like you'd seen on TV. But that didn't matter. You made it. And perhaps that's something we don't talk about enough. Children's television wasn't always just about watching. It encouraged you to do. Get outside. Make something. Draw something. Sing something. Build something. Explore something. And sometimes make an enormous mess in the kitchen. But perhaps the biggest difference between then and now was the waiting. We had to wait. And waiting was everywhere. You waited for your favourite programme. You waited for Saturday. You waited for the next episode. You waited for the Christmas special. You waited for the new series. And if something wasn't on television, you couldn't just find it elsewhere. That sounds frustrating, but it also made television feel important. When something only happens once a week, it became an event. You talked about it at school. You talked about it with your friends. You wondered what would happen next. You tried to remember everything from the previous episode. And then you waited 7 days, sometimes even longer. And when it finally came back, it felt like seeing an old friend, which I know sounds a bit dramatic, but you get my meaning. Children's television didn't stay inside the television. It came into the playground. It became part of conversations. You talked about what you'd watched. You copied characters, you sang theme songs, you repeated jokes, you argued about what was the best, and everyone seemed to know the same things. There was a shared experience. You might not have had exactly the same toys, you might not have liked exactly the same music, but chances were you had seen the same programme. Television gave children a common language, and that made it incredibly powerful. So let's talk about the weirdness, the wonderful weirdness. Children's television could be strange, really strange, and nobody seemed to mind. You could have puppets next to live action presenters, animation next to documentary footage, songs next to educational segments, a serious piece about science, followed by someone dressed as an enormous animal, and somehow it worked. There was a freedom to children's television. It didn't always worry about fitting neatly into a category. It could be educational, funny, scary, silly, musical or surreal, all within the same programme. And perhaps that's why so many adults still remember it. Because TV back then wasn't always predictable. And then came the school holidays. Those wonderful stretches of time when you suddenly had no school. God, I wish that I could have 6 weeks off now. And television became your companion. You could wake up later. You could stay in your pyjamas. You could sit in front of the television and discover something you'd never seen before. The holiday schedules themselves became part of childhood. You knew there would be special programs, special episodes, films, cartoons, and perhaps a few programs that only seemed to appear during the school holidays. There was a different feeling to television during the summer. The days were longer. The sun was coming through the window and you knew you didn't have to go to school. Television wasn't necessarily the whole day, but it was part of the day. And then Christmas. Christmas television at Christmas was something else. The special programs, the Christmas episodes, the films, the music, the decorations, the continuity. The feeling that the entire television schedule had become something different. You could sit there with a bowl of chocolates, if you were lucky, and watch something that you'd been waiting for. And perhaps you'd already seen the trailer or the little advert. Perhaps you'd already heard everyone talking about it. But now, it was finally here. Christmas television was part of Christmas itself. Just like the tree, just like the presents, the food, the decorations. It was all about the anticipation. I think the word I would use is big. Television felt big. Not necessarily because the TVs themselves are massive, usually it wasn't, but because there were fewer things competed for your attention. When your favourite programme was on, that was what you were doing. There weren't hundreds of notifications, there wasn't another screen in your hand, there wasn't an endless list of recommendations. There was simply the programme, and you watched it. You became absorbed in it. For 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 5 minutes, perhaps an hour, you were somewhere else. And when it finished, you came back. And then, eventually, you grew up. That's the sad part. There comes a moment when children's television doesn't seem quite as exciting anymore. You discover different programs, different music, different interests. You become a teenager, and slowly, you move on. But here's the strange thing. You never completely leave. Because years later, you hear a theme tune and suddenly you're back. You can almost see the room. You can remember where the television was. You remember the sofa. You remember the people who were there. You remember what they were doing. You remember being that age. And all of that can come rushing back because of a few seconds of music. From the theme tune, the part that unlocks your childhood memory. So why do we remember children's television so strongly? Well, perhaps it's because childhood is already a time of discovery. Everything feels new. The first time you see a particular character, the first time you hear a particular song or a particular style of song, the first time a program genuinely scares you, the first time something makes you laugh so much that you can't stop. Those experiences become attached to television. But there's something else. Children's television was repetitive, and that's actually a good thing for memory. You hear the same theme tune. You saw the same opening. You heard the same catchphrases. You watched the same character every week. A repetition creates familiarity. Familiarity creates comfort. And comfort creates memories. And perhaps that's the most interesting thing. We didn't know we were making memories. When we were children, we weren't sitting there thinking, this is going to be incredibly nostalgic in 40 years. We weren't thinking, I better remember this theme tune. Of course, we weren't thinking, one day I'm going to miss the television schedule. We were just watching television. We were having fun. We were laughing. We were sometimes getting scared. We were learning. We were waiting. And that's why nostalgia can be so powerful. Because you're not just remembering the programs, you're remembering yourself. Television has changed enormously, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. Children today have access to things we could never have imagined. They can explore subjects from around the world. They can watch programs whenever they want. They can discover new things instantly. They have an incredible amount of choice. But choice changes the experience. When you have everything, nothing necessarily feels quite as rare. When you can watch an episode whenever you want, you don't have to wait. When you can watch an entire series in one day, there's no anticipation for next week. And when there are thousands of programs available, it becomes harder for one program to become part of everyone's childhood. Perhaps that's what we've lost most of all. That feeling that millions of children were watching the same thing at the same time. In different homes, different towns, different parts of the country, but all watching the same program. And then going to school the next day and talking about it. That's a very special thing. It created a shared childhood. And perhaps that's why people of the same generation can meet decades later, mention a program, and immediately start singing a theme tune together. You don't need to explain it, you just know. But here's the good news. The magic hasn't completely disappeared. Because whenever we watch an old program, whenever we hear an old theme, whenever we see an old character, that feeling can come back. For a few minutes, we can be children again. Not literally, of course. We still have bills, responsibilities, jobs, shopping, emails, far too many passwords. But somewhere inside all of that, there's still the child who sat in front of the television, waiting for their favourite programme to begin. And sometimes, all it takes is a familiar tune to find them again. Maybe it wasn't just the programmes. Maybe it was the time in our lives when we watched them. Maybe it was the freedom, the excitement, the waiting, the imagination, the characters, the presenters, the music, the surprises, the shared experiences. The feeling that television was opening up an enormous world and inviting us in. Children's television didn't have to be perfect. It just had to be interesting. It had to make us laugh. It had to make us wonder. It had to make us want to come back next week. And sometimes it just had to make us sit very quietly in front of the television, completely absorbed, while the world outside carried on. So perhaps the next time you hear an old children's television theme tune, don't just think about the programme. Think about where you were. Think about the room. Think about the television. Think about the people around you. Think about what you were interested in. Think about what you wanted to be when you grew up. Think about the things that seemed enormous and things that seemed incredibly important. Because those programs weren't just programs. They were part of your childhood. They were part of our routines. They were part of our conversations. They were part of growing up. And although we can't go back, we can still remember. And perhaps that's the real magic of children's television. It doesn't disappear when the programme ends. It stays with you. In the music, in the characters, in the memories, and sometimes in a little voice inside your head that still remembers exactly what happened next. So switch off the lights, turn down the noise, and just for a little while, let's go back. Back to the television, back to the programmes, back to the theme tunes, back to Saturday mornings, back to school holidays, back to the feeling of sitting in front of the screen, waiting for your favourite programme to begin. Because once upon a time, children's television wasn't just something we watched. It was somewhere we went. And for a little while, we were all there together. So that was a little audio. Actually, gosh, it's over 20 minutes. But I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about children's television, really. Not just a particular show, just my feelings on it, really. It's just, hopefully a lot of you share the same feelings and thoughts that I do about children's TV. I mean, children's TV these days is still great. I mean, the shows are amazing. And for a whole new generation of children, they're going to remember these shows that they're watching now, all being well, for a long, long, long time like we do. But the amazing thing is, like when in the 80s, I used to watch shows that were from the 60s as well. So the funny thing is, children now, they remember shows like Banana Man, The Magic Roundabout. So a lot of the shows that we watched and the ones that we watched that were older, like in the 60s, children these days are still watching. So they're still making these memories. There's a different way that they can consume TV now, of course. But I just want to talk about the nostalgic things from back in our time. In the 80s, that's when I was watching children's TV. I was a 1980s boy. So in the comments below, it would be great to see what shows you used to watch, and hopefully we've covered some of them on those little mini videos that we've been putting out. But if there's any shows that we haven't covered, put them in the comments below and I will add them to my list, which is getting incredibly long. So thank you so much for that. So I know this one also might be a little bit boring compared to some visual ones I've been doing. This is literally just an audio one, which I know some people like, some people don't like. I've got a very strange accent, a bit of Essex, a bit of London, a bit of Hertfordshire, so no one can really place where my accent comes from. So hopefully it's not been too grating on you. But yeah, this is the first of an audio only podcast that I've been doing. And I've got about 25 seconds left on my card here that I'm recording on. So I want to say thank you for listening all the way to the end, or you might have fast forwarded to the end. And I will see you next time on Big Kids TV Podcast. So if you can click the like button, the share button, and put whatever comments you want in the below about what kids shows you watched. And I will see you in the next podcast.